In this video, I'm going to show you 5 different techniques on how to easily make fire starters using sawdust and candle wax. And later on, we're going to test them out. So stick around and let's get into it. The first thing that you're going to need is some wax, and the best source for this is unused candle wax. And I have a lot of it. Years ago, once friends and family realized I was making fire starters with candle wax, well, every time they get the chance, they give me their unused candles, and only a fraction of this can make hundreds of fire starters. The next thing that you'll need is some sawdust. I like to do woodworking on the side, so years ago I bought myself a dust collector, and this one does an awesome job of collecting most of the sawdust I create. So if you're looking at buying a dust collector, I would recommend checking out this brand, and I do have a link in the description if you're interested. I'm not getting paid to say any of this, I've just had a good experience with this brand. Now I'm not going to need all of this sawdust, so I'm going to put it into a different container so it's easier to get to when I need it. So in one of our other videos, I showed how to make carpenter bead traps. And with one of those steps, I ended up with a lot of these wood chips, or flakes, or shavings, whatever you want to call them. But I intentionally saved them because I wanted to find out what would happen if I used these to make fire starters. So coming up here in a little bit, we'll see how this turns out. Some other techniques I wanted to show you is using different kinds of forms. And this is a custom form I made with a layer of wax paper at the bottom, and each form can make up to 24 fire starters. Next up we have an ice cube tray, which can make up to 14 fire starters in one go. And I found this flexible ice mold tray with some fun shapes, and I was curious how this would turn out. And this one can make up to 10 fire starters at once. And the last mold is a paper towel tube. I'm not sure how many fire starters we can get out of this, so we'll have to see. Alright, so let's get cooking. So you're going to need a hot plate, a stove, some sort of heat source to melt the candle wax, and a pot or a pan. The next step is to slowly shave the candle wax. I'm just joking with you. You don't need to do this. For some reason, I couldn't help myself, and I found it really satisfying to shave the candle wax and to watch back for some reason. I don't know why. I don't know if it's just me. So let me know if you found this satisfying or not. So now I'm going to start adding some candles, and they start melting a little bit slow until a layer of melted wax builds up first. And I decided to use smaller candles because they tend to melt a little bit quicker. If you're going to use some bigger candles, I would suggest actually breaking them into smaller pieces somehow. These candles have some metal and wicks in them, so from time to time I reach in and grab these out because I don't want those mixed in with the fire starters. So one thing that you want to be mindful of is to make sure you don't melt too much wax for the container that you're using. Typically you want the melted wax to fill up no more than half the size of the container, because you're going to be adding sawdust to this and you want to make sure you have enough room to mix that in. So I added one of these longer candles just to see what it was like, and it was melting so slow. So I tried to break it a few times and it just wouldn't break, so I just turned up the heat and then it melted a lot faster then. Alright, so I think that's enough melted wax for right now. So now it's time to start adding the sawdust. You might be wondering when to stop adding sawdust. So what I like to do is keep mixing in sawdust until I don't see melted wax pooling up anywhere anymore. And that's how I know I'm done. I don't know about you, but this is starting to look pretty good, so I'm going to give it a taste and see if it's done. Just in case it wasn't obvious, I didn't actually eat this firestarter mix, although it does look a lot like no-bake cookies. I'm not seeing any more melted wax, and the consistency's pretty thick, so that's how we know we can stop adding sawdust at this point. The first form I'm going to use is my custom form, so I'll just spread it out and then compress it down. Next up is the ice cube tray. Next we have this flexible ice mold tray. So I did notice it's more of a pain to use these ice mold trays than just using that custom form I have. It just takes longer to fill them up and compress them down, and it also creates more of a mess. Alright, so now I'm going to add these to the freezer so they cool and harden a little bit quicker. And while that's happening, I'll get started on a new batch using those wood shavings. The first thing I need to do though is melt down some more wax. And my original plan was to just pour the melted wax over the wood shavings, but I think I'll do what I did before and add the wood shavings to the melted wax. So these wood shavings aren't absorbing the melted wax like the sawdust did, which makes sense. So what I'm going to try to do is scrape out the wood shavings and try to leave behind the melted wax. What I'm going for here at the end of the day is just a pile of wax-coated wood shavings. So while I was working on this, I thought it might be a neat idea to add some sawdust with the wood shavings to make some chunky fire starters and see how these turn out. So I'll go ahead and get started on that now. Alright, next up we have the paper towel tube, and I'm going to duct tape one side of it so that the fire starter mixture doesn't just fall out. So I didn't really spend a whole lot of time thinking of the best way to get the mixture into the tube. So this is what I decided to do. And it worked for the most part. It got a little messy at times, but it's not a big deal. And you'll probably want to wear leather gloves during this part. I switched to a glove about halfway through because obviously the tube got very hot. I should have wore gloves on both hands, but I wasn't all that concerned with it, so I ended up just doing a little bit of a finger dance because of my stupidity. So now it's time to start removing these fire starters from some of these forms. And I don't think I let this cool and harden as much as I would have liked. You might notice that in some spots it's a little flexible. So you might want to double check when you're doing this to make sure that it's really hardened before you take it out of the forms. So you can see here in this corner it's a little bit flexible. Ideally you'd want the whole thing to be rigid, solid. It's not a huge deal, but it's something to pay attention to. Here in a little bit I'll cut this up into 1.5" squares. So these were a little bit harder to pop out than I expected. I thought they would just kind of pop out, but it did take a little bit of force to get these out of their molds. And they didn't really hold their shape all that well, which at the end of the day, it was just something different and fun to try. I also thought these would come out a lot easier than what they did, but it was kind of a pain getting these out of here. So before taking this out of the custom form, I should have cut along the perimeter, and I forgot to do that, and it broke there in the corner. Like I mentioned earlier, what I'm going for here is basically just wax-coated wood shavings. So I'm going to break this up into little pieces. So that custom form essentially just makes one large fire starter, and you probably don't want to waste that whole thing on a single fire. So what I like to do is cut that down into 1.5 by 1.5 inch squares. Cookies. I decided to also cut this paper towel tube up on the table saw, and I didn't use any exact measurements for this. I just tried to eyeball it, and they roughly came out to be a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch thick. So here I started to think about how much I enjoy having fingers. So I thought it over for a second and decided to stop while I'm ahead. Just out of curiosity, I wanted to see how easy it was to peel off the paper on the fire starter. But I think you should definitely leave it on there because it should only help with getting the fire starter lit. So before I do a burn test, I just wanted to quickly recap and show you all the different fire starters that we made in this video. First up are the wood shavings, which look like they might ignite just by looking at them wrong. Next we have the fire starters from the ice mold trays. Next we have what I'm calling the chunky fire starter, which is a mixture of the wood shavings and the sawdust, and this one is made just with the sawdust. And lastly, the ones made with the paper towel tube. This is a lot of fire starters because if you think about it, just one of these fire starters will start a fire no problem. The wood shavings, it's a little questionable because those might burn a little quicker and you might need a handful of those. But we're going to see here in a moment how each one of these are going to perform here in this makeshift lab environment where there's no wind or rain or environmental factors really. Alright, time for the fun part. Let's light some stuff on fire. And that lit on fire really quickly. In case you haven't noticed already, I started a timer in the lower right hand corner, which shows the actual burn time of the fire starters. But keep in mind that I've sped up or cut out certain parts of the video, but the timer should change to reflect the actual burn time. Well, there was no problem lighting the wood shavings. I'm really surprised the paper towel tube didn't catch fire right away. It took it a second. For some reason, this dolphin does not want to catch fire. I don't know what's going on here. Alright, finally, there it goes. So after this test is done, I'm actually going to use one of these fire starters to start a real campfire. And keep in mind that the wood I'm going to be using is extremely damp and wet because the day before it rained all day. So we'll see how this fire starter really helps with getting the fire started. I got tired of waiting for this one to finish, so I'm actually going to stop this one early, or at least try to. Alright, so now it's time to try this out for real. So I decided to use the chunky fire starter, which is the mixture of the wood shavings and the sawdust. And it's a little windy out today, so it might be a little hard to get this one started. Yeah, the wind is making it a little difficult, but this should be a lot easier than trying to start the fire without a fire starter. And there we go. Let's see if we can get this fire going. As you can see here, the only thing that's really burning right now is the fire starter because the wood is pretty damp. But after about 5 minutes or so, the fire kicked up nice and strong. So before you go, I just want to thank you for stopping by and watching this video. I hope that you found it helpful. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing because that really helps support the channel. Thanks again and take care.